In the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, farmers and individual workers began to migrate from the country to large cities, where they could find work in factories and mines. Because there were so many people seeking work, wages were meager, employees were easily replaced, and both living and working conditions were subpar. Because conditions were so bad and wages were so poor, not only did parents have to work, but young children as well. Children as young as 6 years old worked 12 to 14-hour days with only an hour break. While equipment was not hard to use, it was often very dangerous, resulting sometimes in injury or even death. Child workers had 3 times as many accidents as adults. A well-known doctor by the name of Michael Ward was interviewed by the House of Lords Committee on the 25th of March, 1819. When I was a surgeon, accidents were very often admitted to the infirmary, through the children's hands and arms having been caught in the machinery. In many instances, the muscles and the skin is stripped down to the bone, and in some instances, a finger or two might be lost. Last summer, I visited Lever Street School. The number of children at the time in the school who were employed in factories were 106. The number of children who had received injuries from the machinery amounted to nearly half. Orphans were subjected to almost slave-like treatment and labor, under the pretense that wages were unnecessary, as their employers gave them food, shelter, and clothing. Herman Melville, author of the famous book Moby Dick, visited a paper mill in 1855. He wrote about what he saw there.
At rows of blank-looking counters, at rows of blank-looking girls with blank white folders in their blank hands, all blankly folding blank paper. Nothing was heard but the low, steady, overruling hum of the iron animals. The human voice was banished from the spot. Machinery, that vaunted slave of humanity, here stood menially served by human beings as slaves serve the Sultan.
In 1861, an article called Life in the Iron Mills appeared in the Atlantic Monthly, the most important magazine of the day. It was written anonymously by a shy woman named Rebecca Harding, who had grown up in the wealthy family in the bustling iron mill town of Wheeling, West Virginia. It was the commonplace folk of Wheeling whom she wrote about.
Masses of men with dull, besotted faces bent to the ground, sharpened here and there by pain or cunning, skin and muscle and flesh begrimed with smoke and ashes, stooping all night over boiling cauldrons of metal, breathing from infancy to death, an air saturated with fog and grease and soot, vileness for soul and body.
In the 1830s, unions were already protesting child labor, saying that it endangered their children's well-being and health. Massachusetts passed the first child labor law in 1836, which stated that children under 15 must attend school for at least 3 months out of the year. A few other states followed suit, but the laws were flimsy and rarely enforced consistently. The issue of child labor was long protested by unions such as the American Federation of Labor, which was led by early labor leader Samuel Gompers.
I am not one to generally encourage strikes, but show me the country in which there are no strikes, and I will show you that country in which there is no liberty.
In 1881, this union met for its first national convention and passed a resolution which suggested that all states should ban employment of children under 14. Samuel Gompers also led the New York labor movement, which funded the legislation which prohibited cigar making in tenements where children were employed. It was in 1892 when the Democratic Party began to take to heart union recommendations that employment of children 15 and under be restricted. This was the first step towards federal regulation of child labor. In 1904, the National Child Labor Committee, or NCLC, was formed. A private nonprofit, it was pivotal in the child labor movement. The organization used a census conducted in 1900 as a main point of their argument against it. According to the census, 1 in 6 children between the ages of 5 and 10 were being used in gainful actions. Not many could be against children being utilized in traditional agricultural work for their families, but few could get behind the practice of hiring children to work in dangerous factories for pitiable wages. Another tool in the arsenal of the NCLC went by the name of Lewis Wicks Hine. Lewis Hine was an American sociologist and photographer, seeking social reform and the end of child slavery, as it was often called. Hine worked for the NCLC, documenting the lives of children in factories and mills. His work was moving and considered instrumental in the organization's cause. In 1924, a constitutional amendment offered by Republican Ohio Congressman Israel Moore Foster was proposed in hopes of granting the federal government authority in regulating child labor, and was passed in Congress. But it failed to be ratified by enough states to pass, so it never took effect.
In 1936, the Walsh-Healy Act required that all contracts with any part of the United States government for goods or supplies worth at least $10,000 must state that the supplier was a manufacturer or regular dealer in the supplies. All people employed in making or furnishing the supplies would be paid no less than what the Secretary of Labor had previously determined to be the prevailing minimum wages for persons employed on similar work or in the particular or similar industries or groups of industries currently operating in the locality where the supplies were made or furnished. No one employed in making or furnishing the supplies would work more than 8 hours a day or 40 hours a week. The business would not employ boys under 16, girls under 18, or prisoners, and none of the work for the contract would be done under hazardous or unsanitary working conditions.
In 1937, another attempt was made to ratify the constitutional amendment, which would grant the national government the power to regulate child labor. It, too, failed to take effect.
Finally, 1938 saw the passing of the Fair Labor Standards Act. With the Fair Labor Standards Act came a national standard of minimum wage, established time-and-a-half pay for overtime, and forbade the employment of minors for gainful practices.